The Chihuahuan Desert in July of 1878 was not merely a place, it was an adversary. To the settlers of West Texas, the sun was a predatory entity, a white-hot eye that scoured the Llano Estacado until the limestone bleached and the scrub brush turned to brittle tinder. For Rosie Dawson, the heat had moved past the point of physical sensation and into something spiritual. Every breath was a draught of liquid lead, searing her lungs and thickening her blood. Her boots, once sturdy leather, had been reduced to flapping husks, the stitching surrendered to the jagged flint and the relentless convection of the earth. She walked not with grace, but with the mechanical, rhythmic determination of the condemned. Her legs had long since gone numb, replaced by a dull, throbbing vibration that echoed the pounding of her heart. In her arms, the weight of 14-month-old Billy felt like an anchor pulling her toward the scorching soil. He had stopped his frantic, thin-blooded wailing 2 miles back, and that silence was a tolling bell in Rosie's mind. It was the silence of a flame flickering out in a vacuum. She whispered to the shimmering horizon, her voice a dry rattle of gravel, practicing the bargain she intended to strike with God or the devil, whichever one appeared first. "Take him," she croaked, her cracked lips weeping beads of blood that evaporated before they could fall. "He's still whole. I'm already broken. Just take the boy and let the desert have the rest of me." Every few hundred yards, Rosie's vision would swim, the horizon unspooling into a kaleidoscopic haze of ochre and violet. She forced her eyes to focus on her right arm, the limb that Uncle Garrett had tried to use as a signature. The burns were a gruesome map of malice, a charred, weeping testament to what happens when a man's greed outstrips his humanity. The blisters had risen in jagged rows, some bursting to reveal the raw, red meat beneath, attracting the persistent, buzzing flies of the scrubland. She knew the signs of the mortification of the flesh. As a daughter of the frontier, she had seen what gangrene and heat could do to a wound, but she didn't care about the arm, nor the fever currently blooming in her marrow like a dark flower. Her world was reduced to the space between her cracked heels and the next fence post. She saw them then, rising like skeletal fingers from the heat shimmer, a line of cedar posts and rusted wire that marked the boundary between the wild, murderous waste and a chance at salvation. And there, standing by a sagging gate, was a silhouette. A man. He was as still as a tombstone, watching her approach with the patient, predatory stillness of a hawk. Rosie didn't scream. She didn't have the moisture for it. She simply adjusted her grip on the bundle that was her brother and kept moving, one agonizing inch at a time, toward the ghost in the heat. If you want to know what happened next, subscribe to our channel and follow Rosie's story to the very end. Drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the map. 6 miles to the east, Tom Mallister was a man who lived in the echoes of a life that had ended 4 years prior. At 48, his face was a topographical map of Texas history, lined by the grit of the cattle trails, the gunpowder of the Ranger Service, and the deep, hollowing furrows of grief. He had spent 15 years wearing a silver star hammered from a Mexican peso, chasing men who had traded their souls for a fast horse and a heavy purse. He had survived the Comanchero raids, the Salt War, and the lawless chaos of the post-war border, but he hadn't survived the yellow fever, not really. While he was 3 counties over, pursuing a horse thief whose name he could no longer recall, the Yellow Jack had slipped into his home like a thief in the night. He had returned to a house that smelled of vinegar and death, finding his wife Caroline and his 7-year-old Sarah cold in their beds. Since that day, the ranch had become his monastery and his prison. He spoke more to the red roans in the corral than to people. He woke at 4, worked until his muscles screamed, and drank enough rye at night to drown the sound of the silence. He was fixing the south fence, the hammer heavy in his calloused hand, when he saw the apparition. In the 110-degree heat, the hard pan of the desert floor often played cruel tricks on the eyes, creating lake water illusions that led thirsty men to their graves. But this shape was wrong. It was too small, too erratic, moving with a staggering, heavy-hipped gait that didn't belong to a coyote or a stray steer. Tom dropped his hammer into the dust, his ranger instincts, long dormant but never dead, surfacing like a submarine. He squinted against the glare, his hand instinctively dropping to the walnut grip of the Colt single-action army at his hip. The shape was a child, a girl carrying a bundle as if it were the last holy relic on earth. She was stumbling, her knees buckling with every third step, her head lolling in a way that signaled the final stages of heat exhaustion. Tom didn't hesitate. He vaulted the cedar fence with a grace that belied his age and began to run. The heat hit him like a physical blow once he left the relative shade of the fence line, but he didn't feel it. He saw the girl collapse when she was still 50 feet away. She didn't fall forward, she simply let go, her nervous system surrendering all at once. She hit the dirt with a sickening thud, but even in the dead weight of her faint, she managed to cradle the bundle so it took none of the impact. As Tom reached her, the bundle began to stir. It was a sound that broke something deep inside his chest, a thin, reedy mewling, the sound of a kitten or a dying bird. It was a baby. Tom knelt in the scorching sand, his shadow falling over the girl like a shroud. Her skin was the color of old parchment, her eyes rolled back in her head, showing only the yellowed whites. But it was her arm that stopped his breath. The burns were intentional. He had seen enough Indian atrocities and white man cruelties to know the difference between an accident and a torture. Someone had held this child's limb into the coals of a stove with calculated, rhythmic pressure. "Hey now," Tom whispered, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. He reached out to touch her shoulder, his touch light as a feather, terrified she might simply crumble into ash. "Can you hear me, little miss? You're at the Mallister place. You're safe." The girl's eyes fluttered, the lids heavy with grit. One eye was a piercing, lucid blue. The other was a swollen, blackened ruin, the flesh around it bruised in shades of eggplant and sickly sulfur. Her lips parted, a crystalline bead of blood appearing in the corner of her mouth. She didn't ask for water. She didn't ask for help. She looked at him with a gaze that was ancient, the look of a soldier who had already accepted the casualty list. "Please," she croaked, the word barely more than a puff of dust. "Take my brother. Take Billy. He's good. He's perfect. He don't need much, just a bit of shade and some milk." Tom felt a cold shiver go down his spine despite the blistering noon sun. He reached for the baby, but the girl's grip tightened with a final hysterical surge of strength. "No," she gasped, her good eye pinning him with a desperate, terrifying intensity. "Take him instead of me. I'm damaged goods. Uncle Garrett said, he said I was a waste of salt. My arm don't work. I'll just eat your food and slow you down. But Billy's got a whole life. Save him. Leave me." Tom sat back on his heels, the desert wind whistling through the mesquite. He was looking at a 10-year-old girl who was attempting to negotiate her own death to ensure the survival of her kin. It was a level of self-sacrifice he hadn't seen since the worst days of the frontier wars. "How old are you, girl?" he asked, his voice thick with a sudden, uncontrollable rage, not at her, but at the world that had brought her to this pass. "10, sir," she whispered. "And you think you aren't worth the saving?" Rosie's expression didn't change. It remained flat, clinical, as if she were discussing the price of cattle. "I know I ain't. Uncle Garrett showed me, right before the fire." Tom looked at the burns again, his mind tracing the pattern. He saw the clear imprint of a man's hand, 4 fingers and a thumb, wrapped around the girl's forearm, forcing it down onto a blistering iron surface. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was an act of domestic sovereignty. "What's your name, child?" he asked, already sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her and the baby in one fluid motion. "Rosie Dawson, sir. Folks just call me Rosie. And the boy is William. He's hungry. He's so hungry." Tom didn't respond with words. He turned back toward the ranch house, his boots kicking up plumes of red dust. As he walked, Tom felt the heat of the girl's fever radiating through his shirt. She was a small thing, mostly bone and grit, but she held on to that baby with the tenacity of a predator. The house, a low-slung structure of sun-dried adobe and heavy oak timbers, loomed ahead like a fortress. Inside, the thick walls held the cool of the previous night, a natural refrigeration that hit them like a benediction as Tom kicked open the front door. He bypassed the main room and went straight to the kitchen, laying Rosie down on a long cushioned settee near the window. The darkness of the house was a shock to her system. She blinked rapidly, her good eyes searching the shadows with a frantic animal terror. "Mister," she whimpered, "I said, you don't got to keep me. You can put me back outside, just the boy. Please." Tom walked to the water pump, the rhythmic clack-clack of the iron handle the only sound in the room. He filled a tin basin with cool subterranean water and brought it to her side. "I heard what you said, Rosie Dawson," Tom said, his voice firm, echoing with the authority of the badge he no longer wore. "But out here, I'm the law, and the law says nobody gets left behind. Not today, not on this land." He dipped a clean rag into the water and pressed it to her forehead, watching as the heat began to bleed out of her. The baby, Billy, had resumed his crying, but it was a stronger sound now, fueled by the change in temperature and the smell of damp earth. Tom reached down and gently extricated the boy from Rosie's grasp. The girl protested, a small, weak sound in her throat, but Tom ignored it. He inspected the infant with a practiced eye. The boy was dehydrated, his soft spot slightly sunken, but his spirit was intact. He was a sturdy child with the same stubborn set of the jaw as his sister. "He's going to be fine, Rosie," Tom said, moving toward the pantry. "I've got milk in the cellar and some honey to sweeten it. He'll be fat as a tick by sundown." He found an old glass bottle in the back of the cupboard, Sarah's bottle. He hadn't touched it in 4 years, a relic of a ghost life. He felt a pang of sharp, crystalline grief as he rinsed it, but he pushed it down. There was work to be done. He returned to Rosie, who was watching him with a look of profound, wary confusion. She didn't understand the concept of a stranger offering help without a price. In her world, every kindness was a debt, and every debt was paid in pain. "Small sips," Tom commanded, holding a tin cup to her lips. "If you guzzle it, your stomach will throw it right back at me, and I only have so many rags." Rosie drank, her throat working convulsively. She closed her eyes as the water hit her system, her body shivering despite the heat. Tom watched her, noting the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, the way her good eye never truly left his hands. She was a beaten creature, a dog that had been kicked until it no longer expected the hand to feed. But as the water began to do its work, a spark of something else appeared in her gaze, a flicker of the same steel that had carried her across the desert. "Uncle Garrett," she whispered, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "He'll come. He's a banker. He says he owns the law. He says he owns us." Tom Mallister reached for his gun belt, which he had draped over the back of a chair. He checked the cylinder of his Colt, the brass cartridges gleaming in the dim light. The sound of the hammer clicking into half-cock was the only answer he needed to give. "Let him come," Tom said, his voice cold and flat as a winter pond. "I've been waiting 4 years for a reason to stand my ground. I reckon a banker from Dusty Springs is a fine place to start." Inside the thick adobe walls of the Mallister ranch, the air smelled of dried sage, old leather, and the metallic tang of well water. Tom moved with a clinical efficiency, his large, scarred hands surprisingly light as he began the grim task of debriding Rosie's wounds. In the 1870s, a burn of this magnitude was often a death sentence, not from the initial trauma, but from the inevitable rot of infection. Tom reached into the cedar chest he hadn't opened in years, pulling out a jar of Martha's salve, a thick, pungent mixture of beeswax, zinc oxide, and distilled pine resin his neighbor used to brew for cattle and kin alike. He soaked a clean linen rag in cool water and began to gently dally at the edges of the raw flesh. Rosie didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She simply stared at the ceiling with a hollow, 1,000-yard stare, her jaw clamped so tight Tom could hear her teeth grinding. This lack of reaction worried him more than any wail of pain. It was the behavior of a creature that had been broken long ago, conditioned to believe that resistance only invited further cruelty. Between the painstaking work on her arm, Tom checked on Billy. The boy was greedily nursing from the old glass bottle, his tiny fingers curled around the neck as he drifted into a milk-drunk stupor. The contrast was heartbreaking, the baby finding solace in a simple meal while his sister sat silently as a man cleaned the literal marks of hell from her bones. As the fever began to subside under the influence of the cool water, Rosie's voice returned, though it remained a fragile, haunted thing. She began to recount the timeline of her nightmare, weaving a story of corporate greed and domestic terror that made Tom's blood simmer. Her father, Patrick Dawson, had been a fair man who owned a productive silver mine in the hills near Dusty Springs. He had refused to sell out to the local consortium, a group of investors led by his own cousin, Garrett Whitmore. Then came the accidents. First, the support beams in the north shaft had mysteriously buckled, claiming 2 workers. Then Patrick himself had disappeared into a collapse that the town's coroner, a man whose mortgage was held by Whitmore's bank, ruled a tragic act of God. Rosie described seeing her uncle in the equipment shed late at night before the collapse, his city slicker suit out of place among the grease and timber. After Patrick's funeral, Garrett had moved into the house, brandishing papers of guardianship that no one in town dared to question. He had turned the home into a prison, slowly stripping away the family's assets, while Margaret, Rosie's mother, grew strangely, progressively ill. "He brought her the tonic every day," Rosie whispered, her good eye clouding with tears. "He told her it was for her nerves, but every time she took it, she'd go grey and her stomach would turn to knots. After she passed, he just wanted the papers signed. He wanted the mine for his own." The dust cloud on the horizon appeared 3 hours before sunset. Tom watched it through his brass spyglass, his heart hardening as he counted 3 riders. The man in the lead was unmistakable. Heavy-set, wearing a 3-piece wool suit that looked absurdly formal against the rugged backdrop of the Texas scrub. This was Garrett Whitmore, a man who fought with ink and interest rates but wasn't above using lead when the ledger didn't balance. Behind him rode 2 enforcers, the kind of hard-eyed drifters who sold their trigger fingers to whoever offered a warm bed and a steady bottle of whiskey. Tom stood on the porch, his gun belt cinched tight, his Winchester leaning against the doorframe. He felt a familiar coldness settle over him, the ranger chill that had seen him through a dozen border skirmishes. He watched as the riders pulled into his yard, their horses lathered and heaving. Whitmore didn't dismount immediately. He sat atop his expensive bay, looking down at the ranch with the disgusted air of a king visiting a hovel. He wiped his red, sweating face with a silk handkerchief and peered at Tom with eyes like cold, wet stones. "You're Mallister!" Whitmore barked, his voice booming with the practiced authority of a man who owned the town's choir. "I'm here for my property. You've got a girl and a baby that belong to the Whitmore estate. Hand them over, and we can avoid a very expensive legal unpleasantness." Tom didn't move. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his shadow stretching long and dark across the porch boards. "Nobody belongs to nobody in this county, Mr. Whitmore," Tom said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried across the yard. "This is Texas, not the old plantations. Those children came to me seeking sanctuary, and they've got it. Now I suggest you turn those horses around before the heat makes you do something you'll regret." Whitmore's face turned a shade of purple that matched the bruising on Rosie's eye. He reached into his coat and produced a folded parchment, waving it like a holy relic. "I have the law on my side, you ignorant sodbuster. These are court-ordered guardianship papers, signed by the territorial judge. I am their legal protector. You are currently harboring runaways and interfering with a lawful custody agreement. That's a hanging offense in some districts." Tom's gaze shifted to the 2 hired guns. They were younger than him, cocky, their hands hovering near their holsters. They didn't see an aging ranger. They saw a lonely rancher who had stayed out in the sun too long. "I don't care if you've got a letter from the governor himself," Tom said, his hand slowly dropping to the grip of his Colt. "I've seen what your protection looks like. I've seen the girl's arm. I've seen the marks of a stove on a 10-year-old's flesh. You take 1 step toward this door, and we're going to find out if your lawyers can argue with a .44 slug." The standoff lasted for a minute that felt like an hour. The only sound was the jingling of bits and the distant, lonely call of a mourning dove. Whitmore looked at Tom, then at the Winchester, then at his men. He was a banker, a man of calculations, and the math of this moment didn't favor him. A direct assault on a fortified position held by a man who clearly had nothing to lose was a bad investment. With a sneer, Whitmore yanked his horse's head around. "You're making a mistake, Mallister. A catastrophic one. I'll be back with the sheriff, and I'll have you stripped of this land and put in a cage. You can't fight the bank. You can't fight the system. Enjoy your house while you still own it." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his 2 hounds trailing in his dust. Tom watched them until they were nothing but specks, but he didn't relax. He knew men like Whitmore didn't give up. They simply regrouped. He went back inside to find Rosie standing by the window, clutching Billy so tightly the baby was starting to fuss. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that broke Tom's heart. "He'll come back," she whispered. "He always comes back. He says he's the law." Tom reached out and placed a firm, steady hand on her shoulder. "He's the money, Rosie. There's a difference. And tonight, we're going to find out where the sheriff stands." By the time the stars began to pierce the velvet black of the Texas sky, another rider approached. This one was alone, and he didn't come with the thunder of a threat. Sheriff Jake Callahan dismounted with the slow, aching joints of a man who had spent too many decades in the saddle. He was a lean, weathered lawman with a badge that had lost most of its shine but none of its weight. He met Tom on the porch, accepting a tin cup of black coffee with a weary nod. "Garrett Whitmore was in my office an hour ago, screaming for your head on a platter, Tom," Jake said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "He's got the papers, legal, binding, and signed by Judge Morrison. On paper, those kids belong to him. If I don't bring them back, he'll have my badge by Monday." Tom looked at his old friend, searching for a spark of the man he used to hunt outlaws with. "The papers don't mention the stove, Jake. They don't mention the marks on that girl's arm or the arsenic that likely killed her mother. You want to be the man who hands a 10-year-old back to a monster just because the ink is dry?" Jake sighed, the sound of a man caught between his conscience and his career. "I don't want to be that man, but Whitmore owns half the town. He owns the mayor, the bank, and the mercantile. If I cross him, I'm not just losing a job. I'm losing the only law this town has left. Without me, Whitmore just hires 10 more of those gunmen and comes out here himself." Tom sat on the porch railing, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of Dusty Springs. The town was a spiderweb of debt, and Garrett Whitmore was the spider at the center. "Then we need more than my word and a girl's scars, Jake. We need Dr. Peaton." The sheriff's expression shifted, a flicker of professional interest crossing his face. "The doctor? Why him?" Tom leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Rosie says her mother was sick for weeks. Symptoms that sound a lot like slow poisoning. Peaton was the one who treated her. He's a man of science, Jake. He keeps records. If Whitmore was dosing that woman, Peaton's ledgers will show the pattern. And what about the mine? Rosie says Patrick Dawson's accident didn't sit right with the workers. If we can get Peaton to talk, if we can get those records, we don't just have a custody dispute, we have a murder case." Jake Callahan looked at the house, then back at Tom. He knew the risk. If they moved against Whitmore and failed, they'd both be buried in unmarked graves. But if they succeeded, they might just save the soul of the county. "Peaton is a coward, Tom. Whitmore's been donating to his clinic for years, but maybe, just maybe, if he sees what happened to that girl, he'll find his backbone. I'll keep the peace in town for as long as I can. But you stay ready. Whitmore isn't waiting for a judge. He's gathering a posse of his own, and they won't be wearing badges." The night deepened, and the silence of the ranch became heavy with anticipation. Tom stayed on the porch long after the sheriff left, his rifle across his knees. He thought about the legal complexities of the frontier, the law of the dollar that Whitmore practiced, where power was bought and sold like cattle, versus the law of the badge he had once believed in. He realized that the only law that truly mattered out here was the one you were willing to defend with your life. Inside, Rosie had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, her hand still resting on Billy's cradle. She was a child of the frontier, forged in fire and grit, and she had traveled through hell to find a man who would stand for her. Tom looked at his calloused hands, the hands of a man who had spent 4 years waiting for a reason to care. He realized then that he wasn't just protecting 2 children. He was reclaiming his own humanity. He began to plan. He knew the ranch better than any hired gun. He knew the choke points, the shadows, and the places where a single man with a Winchester could hold off a dozen. He knew the midnight siege was coming, and for the first time in 4 years, Tom Mallister felt truly alive. He would turn his home into a fortress, and he would show Garrett Whitmore that some things in Texas weren't for sale. The transition from dusk to deep night in West Texas is a sudden, violent affair that brings a deceptive chill to the air. Tom Mallister worked by the dim light of a kerosene lantern, his movements deliberate and devoid of haste. He knew the physics of his home better than any architect. The adobe walls were nearly 2 feet thick, a mixture of sun-baked mud and straw that could stop a .45 caliber slug as effectively as a granite cliff. He began by sandbagging the lower panes of the windows with sacks of grain from the barn, leaving only narrow slips for his rifle barrel. He laid out his arsenal on the heavy oak dining table, a Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle, the weapon that was currently winning the West, and 2 Colt single-action Army revolvers. He checked the action on the Winchester, the mechanical clack-clack of the brass carrier block sounding like a clock ticking toward midnight. He counted out his 44-40 cartridges, arranging them in neat rows of 10. There was a grim, mathematical comfort in the preparation. He wasn't just a rancher defending his property, he was a tactical operator reverting to the training of his youth. He understood that in a siege, the defender has the advantage of the inner line, provided he doesn't lose his nerve when the lead starts splintering the doorframe. He looked at the heavy timber of the front door, reinforced with a crossbar of solid hickory, and knew that for Whitmore's men to get inside, they would have to pay a price in blood that most mercenaries weren't willing to settle. In the corner of the room, Tom pulled back a worn, braided rug to reveal the trap door of the storm cellar. This wasn't merely a hole in the ground. It was a reinforced bunker hewn into the caliche clay, intended for the terrifying tornadoes that occasionally raked the plains. "Rosie," he called softly. The girl appeared from the kitchen, her bandaged arm cradled against her chest, her eyes wide as she took in the barricaded windows and the gleaming brass of the ammunition. Tom pointed to the dark opening. "I want you and Billy down there. There are blankets, water, and enough dried beef to last 3 days. There's a ventilation pipe that runs to the surface, and a crawl-space tunnel that exits 50 yards east, behind the boulders near the creek. If the house catches fire, or if I don't come for you by sunrise, you take that tunnel and you run toward the Comanche camp I told you about." Rosie looked at the dark hole, then back at Tom, her jaw trembling. "I can help," she whispered. "I can reload." Tom knelt, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You've done your fighting, Rosie. You carried your brother through the fire. Now it's my turn to hold the line. Your job is to keep Billy quiet. If you hear shooting, don't scream. If you hear someone walking above, don't breathe. I'll give the signal when it's over. 3 knocks, then 2, then 3 again. You don't open that door for anyone else. You understand me?" Rosie nodded, a single tear cutting a path through the dust on her cheek before she disappeared into the earth with her brother. The first hint of the coming storm wasn't a sound, but a vibration felt through the soles of Tom's boots. The desert was vast and silent, but the rhythmic thrum of galloping horses carried for miles across the hard pan. Tom blew out the lantern, plunging the house into a thick, velvety darkness. He moved to the front window, sliding the barrel of the Winchester through the gap in the sandbags. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, providing just enough light to see the shadows detaching themselves from the mesquite brush. He counted them as they fanned out. 6, maybe 7 riders. They weren't hiding their approach. They were coming with the arrogance of men who thought they were facing a solitary, aging rancher. They pulled up just outside the range of a pistol shot, their horses shifting and snorting in the cool night air. A man in the center, taller than the others and wearing a wide-brimmed hat, spurred his horse forward. "Mallister!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the adobe walls. "We know you're in there. We've got a legal warrant for those children, signed and sealed. You can hand them over now and keep your skin, or we can burn you out and take them anyway. Mr. Whitmore doesn't care how they come back as long as they're in his possession." Tom didn't answer. He adjusted his sight, centering the front post on the man's chest. He felt the weight of the trigger, the creep of the sear, and the absolute clarity of a man who had made his peace with the world. If you want to know what happened next, subscribe to our channel and follow Rosie's story to the very end. Drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the map. The silence was broken by the sharp, whip-crack report of the Winchester. The man in the wide-brimmed hat didn't even have time to scream. The .44 slug caught him square, throwing him backward off his horse like a rag doll. Immediately, the night erupted in chaos. The remaining mercenaries scrambled for cover, diving behind the watering trough and the stone walls of the corral. Muzzle flashes winked like angry fireflies from the darkness, and the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of bullets hitting the adobe walls filled the room. Tom moved from window to window, never staying in the same spot for more than 2 shots. He was a phantom in his own home, utilizing the darkness to mask his position. He saw a shadow darting toward the barn and squeezed the trigger. The man stumbled and went down, clutching his thigh. The air inside the house grew thick with the acrid, sulphurous smell of black powder smoke, stinging Tom's eyes and parching his throat. He felt a hot sting across his shoulder, a splinter of wood from the window frame, but he ignored it. He was focused on the cadence of the fight. He knew they would try to rush the door eventually, thinking they could overwhelm him with numbers. He transitioned to his shotgun, a double-barreled greener loaded with buckshot, and waited. He could hear them shouting orders, the desperation creeping into their voices as they realized the aging rancher was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Deep beneath the floorboards, Rosie sat in the suffocating darkness of the cellar, her back against the damp clay wall. She held Billy tight against her chest, her hand over his mouth to muffle his confused whimpers. Above her, the world was ending. Every shot from Tom's rifle sounded like a thunderclap, vibrating through the very earth she sat on. She could hear the heavy boots of men on the porch, the splintering of wood, and the muffled curses of the attackers. Her mind raced back to the night her father died. The same sounds of violence, the same feeling of helplessness. But this time was different. This time, there was a man upstairs who had looked her in the eye and told her she was worth saving. She closed her eyes and began to hum a low, wordless melody her mother had taught her, a Comanche song for staying hidden from the wind. She focused on the rhythm of Tom's movements above, counting the shots, praying for the sound of the signal. The heat in the cellar was rising, the air growing stale, but she didn't move. She was a guardian now, the last line of defense for her brother, and she would sit in this hole until the sun burned out, if it meant he was safe. She felt the heavy thump of something falling directly above the trapdoor. A body, perhaps, or a piece of furniture, and she squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The siege shifted when the attackers tried to use fire. Tom saw a man crouching near the corner of the house, striking a match to a bundle of kerosene-soaked rags. The adobe wouldn't burn, but the wooden roof shingles would go up like tinder. Tom knew he had to act. He didn't fire from the window. Instead, he slipped out the back door, moving with the silent, predatory grace he'd learned during his years tracking Comancheros. He circled the house, the cool grass dampening the sound of his boots. He found the arsonist just as the man was about to toss the torch. Tom didn't use his gun. He used the butt of his rifle, a silent, crushing blow that sent the man into unconsciousness. But as he turned to head back inside, he found himself staring down the barrels of 2 revolvers. The remaining mercenaries had caught on to his maneuver. "Drop it, Ranger," one of them sneered, his face illuminated by the flickering torch on the ground. Tom felt the cold weight of failure. He had the children's lives in his hands, and he had let his guard down. But just as the mercenary's finger began to tighten on the trigger, a new sound entered the fray, a chorus of shouts and the thunder of dozens of hoofbeats. A line of torches appeared on the horizon, moving toward the ranch with the speed of a prairie fire. It wasn't a military relief column. It was a mob. At the head of the group was Essie Morales, driving her supply wagon like a chariot of war, flanked by Miguel Santos and a dozen miners from the silver works. They were armed with pitchforks, old muskets, and the sheer, unadulterated rage of the oppressed. Behind them rode Sheriff Jake Callahan, his badge gleaming in the torchlight. The mercenaries, seeing the size of the approaching force, didn't wait to argue. They scrambled for their horses, abandoning their wounded and fleeing into the black maw of the desert. Tom stood by the corner of his house, his chest heaving, as the townspeople poured into his yard. Essie jumped from her wagon before it had even come to a full stop, rushing toward Tom. "Are they safe?" she screamed over the din of the shouting men. Tom nodded, unable to find his voice. He led the way back into the house, his legs feeling like lead. He shoved aside the heavy chest he'd moved over the rug and knocked on the floorboards. 3 times, then 2, then 3 again. The trapdoor creaked open, and Rosie's soot-stained face appeared. When she saw the room filled with the familiar faces of the town, the people who had once looked the other way but were now standing in her kitchen, she let out a sob that broke the tension of the night. Sheriff Callahan stepped into the room, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. He looked at the bodies in the yard, then at the terrified children, then at Tom. "They tried to kill a man on his own land, Tom, in front of witnesses." He looked at the miners and townspeople, who were now nodding and muttering in agreement. Whitmore overplayed his hand. He thought he could buy the town's silence forever, but he forgot that even a dog will bite if you kick it long enough. Essie was already tending to Rosie's arm, her hands gentle as she reapplied the salve. Miguel Santos stood by the door, his hand on the hilt of a heavy skinning knife. "The banker is still in town," Miguel said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He's sitting in his big house waiting for the news that these children are dead or captured. I say we don't make him wait. I say we bring the news to him." The room went silent. The midnight siege had been won, but the war was far from over. Tom looked at Rosie, then at the badge on Jake's chest. He knew that as long as Garrett Whitmore held the keys to the bank, he held the keys to their lives. "We don't go as a lynch mob," Tom said, his voice regained its iron authority. "We go as the law. We get the doctor's records and we bring Whitmore to a judge. But first, we need to move, before he realizes his hounds didn't bite." The plan was formed in the flickering shadows of the bullet-riddled kitchen. Tom would lead a small group, the sheriff, Essie, and Miguel, into town under the cover of the pre-dawn mist. They would bypass the main road and enter through the back alleys, heading straight for Dr. Peaton's clinic. If the records existed, they were the silver bullets needed to kill the monster. Rosie insisted on coming, her eyes burning with a fierce, cold light. "I know where he keeps them," she said. "The doctor told me once that the truth is the only thing worth hiding." Tom looked at the girl and saw not a victim, but a survivor who was ready to claim her justice. He realized then that the frontier hadn't just produced men like Whitmore, it had produced children like Rosie. They prepared to leave, the townspeople staying behind to guard the ranch and tend to the wounded. As Tom saddled his roan, he looked up at the stars, which were beginning to pale as the first hint of grey touched the eastern horizon. He knew that by this time tomorrow, they would either be free or they would be dead. But as he looked at the small, determined figure of Rosie mounting her own pony, he knew he'd rather die fighting by her side than live another day in the silence of his grief. The pre-dawn mist of West Texas in 1878 was a ghost-grey shroud, a liminal space where the heat of the previous day collided with the sudden, sharp chill of the high plains. Tom Mallister led the small group toward Dusty Springs, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp caliche and the thick, low-lying fog that clung to the arroyos. Beside him, Rosie sat small and rigid in the saddle, her bandaged arm tucked into the oversized wool coat Tom had given her. She looked like a child playing at being a soldier, but her eyes held a crystalline focus that belonged to a veteran. Behind them rode Sheriff Callahan and Essie Morales, their expressions grim under the brims of their hats. The town of Dusty Springs was a settlement built on the promise of silver and the reality of debt, a collection of false-fronted timber buildings and sun-bleached adobe structures that seemed to huddle together against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the desert. In 1878, these frontier towns were often fiefdoms, and Dusty Springs was the private domain of Garrett Whitmore. As they approached the outskirts, avoiding the main road where Whitmore's night watchman patrolled, Tom felt the oppressive weight of the banker's law. Every flickering lantern in a window felt like a watchful eye, every creak of a swinging signpost a warning. The town smelled of coal smoke, wet cedar, and the stale, yeasty breath of the saloons, a sensory tapestry of a civilization that was still more savage than settled. They dismounted in the shadow of the livery stable, tethering their horses in a thicket of scrub oak. "The clinic is 2 blocks north, next to the Episcopal Church," Rosie whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic clack-clack of a distant windmill. "Dr. Peaton has a back entrance for the miners. He says sickness doesn't always come through the front door." They moved with the practiced stealth of the hunted, sticking to the alleys where the shadows were deepest. Tom kept his Winchester at the ready, his thumb resting on the hammer, his senses tuned to the low-frequency hum of the waking town. They reached the clinic, a modest, whitewashed structure that sat back from the street. The air here was different, sharper, cleaner, smelling of carbolic acid and the bitter medicinal tang of ether. It was the smell of the frontier's desperate struggle against mortality. Rosie led them to a heavy oak door at the rear, her fingers tracing the frame until she found the hidden iron latch. "He never locked this one," she murmured, a ghost of a smile touching her cracked lips. "He said if a man is dying at 3 in the morning, he shouldn't have to wait for a key." They slipped inside, the darkness of the interior pressing in on them, heavy with the silence of the recently deceased. The clinic was in a state of violent disarray. By the light of a shuttered lantern, Tom saw cabinets thrown open, glass vials shattered across the floor, and medical charts scattered like autumn leaves. Someone had already been here, searching for the very truth they had come to find. Rosie's breath hitched in her throat as she stepped over a broken porcelain basin. This was the place where her mother had spent her final days, a room filled with the sterile, hopeless atmosphere of a losing battle. "They didn't find it," Rosie said, her voice gaining a strange, iron-clad certainty. "Uncle Garrett's men. They look with their greed, not their memories. They don't know the doctor like I do." She walked past the ransacked desk and the empty medicine chests, heading straight for the massive floor-to-ceiling apothecary cabinet that occupied the far wall. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, carved from dark cherry wood, its dozens of tiny drawers labeled in neat Latin script. To any intruder, it was merely a storage unit, but to Rosie, it was a puzzle box. She reached up, her small fingers searching the intricate molding at the very top, her movements guided by a childhood spent watching the doctor hide his special peppermint drops from the local children. With a distinct mechanical click, a section of the molding recessed, and a hidden vertical compartment slid forward. Inside lay 3 leather-bound ledgers, their covers worn smooth by years of handling. Tom stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took the first volume. This was the Vade Mecum, the doctor's secret diary of the town's true health. They huddled around the lantern, the light casting long, flickering shadows as Tom flipped through the pages. The handwriting was precise, a record of every miner's cough, every child's fever, and every mysterious ailment that had plagued the Dawson family. In the entry for March of 1878, the text became a chilling narrative of forensic suspicion. Patient: Margaret Dawson. Symptoms: persistent gastric inflammation, peripheral neuropathy, garlic-scented breath. Diagnosis: suspected chronic arsenicosis. Tom felt a cold rage settle in his marrow. Arsenic, the king of poisons, was common enough in the 19th century, used in everything from wallpaper pigments to pest control, but in the hands of a man like Whitmore, it was a silent, undetectable assassin. The ledger documented the tonics Garrett brought daily, noting that the patient's condition improved only when the benefactor was away on business. It wasn't just a medical record, it was a map of a slow-motion murder. "Look here," Rosie whispered, pointing to a later entry regarding her father's death at the mine. Dr. Peaton had performed a clandestine examination of the timbers retrieved from the collapse. Findings: the heartwood of the support beams shows clear evidence of cross-cut sawing, masked by a superficial application of coal tar. This was no natural rot. The earth didn't reclaim Patrick Dawson, a saw did. The sheriff leaned in, his face pale in the lantern light. "This is it, Tom. This is the rope for Whitmore's neck. It's not just the word of a child. It's the forensic testimony of a man who saw the truth and was too scared to speak it until he wrote it down for the dead." But the moment of triumph was short-lived. A sudden, sharp, metallic snick echoed through the room, the sound of a hammer being pulled back on a heavy revolver. The front door of the clinic swung open, and the grey light of dawn flooded in, silhouetting a heavy, imposing figure. Garrett Whitmore stood there, his city suit rumpled, a silver-plated Smith & Wesson Schofield pointed directly at Tom's chest. Behind him were 2 of his remaining hired guns, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hat brims. "I expected better of you, Mallister," Whitmore sneered, his voice a oily, cultured rumble that didn't belong in a house of healing. "Sneaking into a dead man's office like a common thief. I suppose the solitude of that ranch has rotted your sense of decorum." He took a step into the room, his eyes fixing on the ledgers in Tom's hand. "Give me the books, Tom. They're the property of the estate now, and as legal guardian, I have a right to audit the doctor's accounts. You're overstepping your bounds. You're playing a game where the rules are written in ink you can't afford." Tom didn't lower the Winchester. He shifted his weight, shielding Rosie with his body. "The rules are changing, Whitmore. The ink in these books is written in the blood of the people you murdered. And out here, the only auditor that matters is the one holding the faster gun." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a coiled spring ready to snap. Whitmore laughed, a dry, hollow sound. You think a dusty book changes anything? I own the court, the telegraph, and the sheriff's salary. You're a ghost of a dead era, Mallister, a ranger without a star. Give me the records or the girl dies first. In that moment, the power dynamic of Dusty Springs shifted. Rosie didn't shrink back. She stepped out from behind Tom, her one good eye fixed on her uncle with a look of such profound, icy contempt that the banker actually flinched. "You can kill us," she said, her voice echoing with the authority of the truth. "But you can't kill the town. Look outside, Uncle Garrett." Whitmore glanced toward the window, his expression of arrogance faltering. The mist had begun to lift, and through the glass he could see the shapes of men and women gathering in the street. It wasn't just the miners or the ranch hands, it was the shopkeepers, the mothers, and the laborers. They were silent, armed with whatever they could find, shotguns, heavy wrenches, and the sheer collective weight of their realization. The news of the midnight siege had traveled through the town like a wildfire, and the people of Dusty Springs had finally reached the breaking point the sheriff had spoken of. They weren't a lynch mob yet, but they were a jury. They stood in the grey light of morning, a wall of human conscience that no amount of bank interest could buy. Sheriff Callahan stepped forward, his own badge catching the first rays of the rising sun. "It's over, Garrett. Put the gun down. You're not facing a lone rancher anymore. You're facing the county." Whitmore looked at the crowd, then at the ledgers, then back at his hired guns. He saw the hesitation in his men's eyes, the realization that they weren't being paid enough to die at the hands of an entire town. With a curse, Whitmore lowered his weapon, his face turning a sickly, mottled grey. "This is a farce," he spat, though the tremor in his hand betrayed him. "I'll have the territorial governor here by sundown. I'll have you all in chains for conspiracy." Tom didn't answer. He handed the ledgers to the sheriff and took Rosie's hand. They walked out of the clinic and into the street, the crowd parting for them like the Red Sea. The silence was absolute as they walked toward the jailhouse, the only sound the rhythmic tolling of the church bell. Tom looked at Rosie and saw the weight of the world slowly lifting from her shoulders. They had the records. They had the man. Now, they just had to survive the law. The atmosphere inside the Dusty Springs courthouse in August of 1878 was a pressurized chamber of heat, cedar dust, and the electric hum of a town on the precipice of change. Judge Elias Morrison, a man whose reputation for hanging justice was balanced by a rigorous adherence to the letter of the law, sat upon the bench like a figure carved from dark oak. In the 19th century West, the arrival of a circuit judge was more than a legal necessity. It was a cultural event, a rare moment where the chaos of the wild frontier was forced to bow to the rituals of civilization. The courtroom was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the scent of tobacco, unwashed wool, and the sharp metallic tang of the desert. Garrett Whitmore sat at the defense table, his silk suit now wrinkled and stained, his eyes darting toward the gallery with a mixture of terror and lingering arrogance. He was flanked by two high-priced attorneys from Austin, men who spoke with the polished, rhythmic cadence of the city, attempting to dismiss the forensic evidence of Dr. Peaton's ledgers as the delirious scribblings of a dying morphine addict. They argued that the marks on Rosie's arm were self-inflicted, a desperate cry for attention from a troubled orphan, and that the tonics Garrett had provided were merely the generous offerings of a concerned kinsman. Prosecutor Daniel Carver, however, was no longer a nervous amateur. Backed by Tom Mallister's steady presence and the raw, undeniable reality of the doctor's records, he began to build a forensic cage around the banker. He presented the arsenic entries not just as medical notes, but as a timeline of a cold-blooded assassination. In 1878, the science of toxicology was in its infancy, but the symptoms documented by Peaton, the specific patterns of skin discoloration and the garlic breath mentioned in the logs, were textbook markers that even a layperson could understand. Carver then moved to the physical evidence of the mine collapse, producing the microscopic wood shavings Tom had recovered from the site. He explained the concept of structural sabotage, a phrase that sent a murmur of understanding through the room. The miners in the audience knew the sound of the earth shifting, and the idea that a man would saw through the heartwood of a support beam was a betrayal that transcended mere theft. It was a violation of the code of the West, a sacred understanding that out here, where the land was already trying to kill you, you did not sabotage the tools of another man's survival. The tension reached its zenith when Rosie was called to the stand. She looked impossibly small in the witness chair, her bandaged arm resting on the railing, her feet dangling inches above the floor. One of Whitmore's attorneys stepped forward, his voice a low, condescending purr designed to rattle a child. "Miss Dawson, isn't it true that your mother was known for her imaginative stories, and that you, being a child of mixed and unstable heritage, might simply be confused by the tragedy of your parents' passing?" He was leaning on the prejudices of the era, the hollowing social stigmas that often silence the voices of the marginalized. But Rosie didn't flinch. She looked the attorney in the eye with a clarity that silenced the room. "My mother told me the truth about the world," she said, her voice small but carrying the weight of iron. "She told me that some men are like the drought. They take everything and leave nothing behind. I didn't see a ghost in the equipment shed. I saw a man who owned a bank but wanted to own our lives. And I didn't burn myself. I saw the fire in his eyes before I felt it on my skin." The legal maneuver that finally broke Whitmore's defense was the revelation of Rosie's Comanche lineage. In 1878, the relationship between the Texas Territory and the indigenous nations was fraught with violence and shifting treaties, but federal law provided a narrow, potent window for tribal sovereignty. Tom had arranged for Chief Samuel Crow Feather to enter the courtroom. The arrival of the chief, a man who had survived the Red River War and the hollowing out of the southern plains, was a sensory shock to the townspeople. He wore his traditional regalia with a quiet dignity that commanded the space. He testified that Rosalie's grandmother, Laughing Wind, had never forfeited her status within the nation, and that under the standing treaties the children were eligible for tribal protection. This meant that the guardianship papers Whitmore had purchased through territorial channels were in direct conflict with federal tribal recognition. It was a jurisdictional trap that Whitmore's lawyers hadn't prepared for. Suddenly, Garrett wasn't just fighting a lonely rancher. He was fighting the federal government's recognition of a sovereign family unit. The banker let out a choked, animalistic sound of frustration, a noise that signaled the final collapse of his carefully constructed facade. Judge Morrison didn't wait for a long deliberation. He had seen the way the town had stood outside the clinic, and he had heard the cold, forensic truth of the doctor's ledger. He looked at Garrett Whitmore with a look of profound disgust. "The law is a tool of order, Mr. Whitmore, not a weapon of larceny," the judge declared, his gavel hovering like a guillotine blade. "You have used the ink of the bank to hide the blood on your hands, but the desert has a way of surrendering its secrets." Morrison ruled that the evidence of foul play was sufficient to bind Whitmore over for a criminal trial in the territorial capital and immediately terminated his guardianship. But the true climax came when the judge turned his attention to Tom Mallister. He reviewed the adoption petition Tom had filed, a document that sought to make the Ranger's sanctuary a permanent home. The judge looked at the scars on Tom's hands and the light in Rosie's eyes. "Thomas Mallister, you have proven that fatherhood is not an accident of biology, but a choice of the soul. Under the combined recognition of this territory and the Comanche Nation, I hereby declare Rosalie and William Dawson to be your children in the eyes of God and the law." The celebration at the ranch that evening was a quiet, luminous affair. The townspeople had brought supplies, sacks of flour, jars of preserves, and fresh timber to repair the bullet holes in the adobe walls. Tom sat on the porch, watching as Rosie played in the dust with Billy, the baby's laughter a musical counterpoint to the crickets in the grass. He felt the heavy, suffocating silence of the last 4 years finally lifting, replaced by the chaotic, beautiful noise of a living family. He looked at his home, realizing that it was no longer a fortress of grief, but a cradle of hope. He thought about Caroline and Sarah, and for the first time, the memory didn't bring a sharp, crystalline pain. Instead, he felt a sense of continuity. He had been a man who hunted the lost, and in doing so, he had found himself. He realized that the lone star wasn't just a symbol on a badge or a flag. It was the light that guided a man back from the darkness when he found something worth fighting for. Rosie walked up to him, leaning her head against his knee, her bandaged arm finally beginning to heal. "Are we staying, Papa?" she asked, the title sounding natural, like a word she had known her whole life. Tom Mallister looked out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the West Texas horizon. The desert was still there, brutal, indifferent, and beautiful, but it no longer felt like an adversary. It felt like a foundation. "We're staying, Rosie," Tom said, his voice thick with a peace he had never expected to find again. "We're going to build something here that no drought can wither and no fire can burn. We're going to show this land that the Mallisters are a stubborn lot." As the sun dipped below the Llano Estacado, painting the sky in shades of bruised gold and fiery crimson, the three of them stood together. A retired ranger, an orphan of the fire, and a baby of the plains. They were a family forged in the kiln of the frontier, a testament to the idea that out here, where the earth is hard and the sun is mean, the only thing that truly survives is the love you are willing to defend with your life. The story of the kiln of West Texas had begun with a girl walking out of the heat, but it ended with a man walking back into the light. The saga was complete, but for Tom, Rosie, and Billy, the real story, the story of a life lived together, was only just beginning.